Welcome back to the HallOfSportz Podcast, and we're back for another episode of the Rugby Room. I'm joined today by one of my good friends, Stephen, from the Master of None podcast. How are you doing today, Stephen?
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me on again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's a lot going on in the rugby world. Look, we're getting to see Six Nations this weekend again. Midweek, we got the fixtures that came out for the round of 16 for the Champions and Challenge Cup, and then today we got the breaking news of the big deal for CVC along with the Six Nations, which I guess we'll kind of touch on at the start. But again, for the most part today, we'll probably be focusing mainly on the Champions Cup and Challenge Cup to just kind of give us a break from just international rugby over the last couple of weeks anyway. So, look, the story today was that there was a deal struck by the Six Nations and CVC for £365 million. Now, what we've kind of found out is where it's been divided thus far. So the RFU in England get 95 million, the IRFU getting 48 million, the SFU getting 45 million, and the WFU getting 51, with the rest of the 125, 126 million split between Italy and France. I don't believe that they've actually come out and said exactly how much they've gotten. The only reason we know the others is because the different, the RFU, IRFU have come out and they've said how much that they've been allocated. So I guess the key question here is whether you think this is good for the Six Nations, and then in terms of for the IRFU, where do you think that they should start looking to allocate some of these extra funds for?
It's good in a sense that like the money is not exactly plentiful in rugby at the moment with COVID. So look, there's money coming in, which is a plus. The negative side and the cynical, in me would always say that we fear another paywall coming when it comes to Six Nations rugby. If you want to watch rugby, all the rugby you want to watch in this day and age legally, you have to pay an exorbitant amount of money a month. And Six Nations is one of the few bits of rugby that's actually free to watch at the moment on, the national channels. So we hope it doesn't, or at least if it does, I think a lot of people would be happy if it's just, if you pay one monthly subscription, you get all the rugby. That would be great. Do you know what I mean? Even if it is a bit pricey, at least you're paying one payment a month and not paying like 3 or 4 at the moment. Like I know we'll talk about the Super Rugby later on, but that's another paywall that people had to pay. In terms of the allocation, look, it's tough to know. You would hope that they would invest in grassroots upwards in all the provinces fairly. I know Leinster will probably get a large chunk of it because of the team that they are. I don't think it can ever be the importance can never be stressed enough about investing in grassroots and making every province better in that sense, and that would then improve. You would imagine that should improve the international team, and we've seen it like the Pro 14 now. That the top 4 teams, the top 2 teams in each conference are Irish teams, but we'll see now when we get chatting about Europe and when these teams actually go and play in Europe, how good actually are they? We don't know yet, and that's the issue. So we need to kind of just keep investing that money back into the clubs, into the provinces, and then we should see the fruits of that labor, in 10, 20 years down the line.
Yeah, I completely agree on that one. The whole idea is it needs to go into grassroots rugby, because we've seen what the popularity of rugby has been in this country over the past 20 years, and then how, or even not even the past 20 years, you can probably look at maybe past 12 to 13 years where it's gotten more popular, and you're seeing that investment actually come to fruition, where we've been as good as we've been over kind of the last 10 years, which you would have never thought that an Irish team would be able to go out and challenge New Zealand and actually be able to beat them. But again, like you said, there's a big difference that we're seeing in even just in the academy structure, where there's a lot of players that have come through Leinster, and now that's trickled into the other provinces. But what you really want is each of the provinces having an academy system like Leinster, where when one player decides that, let's say they're in their 30s and they want to move on and make more money and go to France, that it's very simple to then pluck a player out from your academy, bring them in, and kind of develop it that way. We're seeing that done pretty well at Leinster, but we're not seeing it as equally well done at the other provinces, which is ideally what we need. Because look, this is one of the debates I've always had with some of my friends about this when we compare Ireland and England. You look at England; they have so many different teams in the Premiership that it's easy to develop players. For Ireland, it's tough because if you don't have those 4 provinces doing well and kind of bringing players through, you're relying on 1 or 2 particular teams to basically bring through your whole national team, and that's a problem, because it's always been better when there are players coming through each province, and I feel that this is exactly where this money should go from. The one thing I don't want to see this money go to is if it goes to the 4 provinces and then this money is spent on bringing players into the club from overseas. That's the last thing I want to see. I would rather see, even if it's to improve the facilities around the academy, if it's to improve, like we said, kids rugby, so that it's, 1, that it's more competitive, 2, that you get more kids into it, because the more that we get in, really, you're going to see the advantages kind of later on, like you mentioned. So that's a big thing, and I guess where we're going to go to is, like you said, we looked at the kind of Pro 14. We look at the likes of Munster, Leinster, and Ulster have had a really good season in particular. I know for a while it looked like Ulster might have actually made it through, and I think it was up to that Leinster-Ulster game that if Leinster lost them, they weren't going to be able to get into the final. And but then today what we'll be looking at is kind of like you mentioned, the Champions Cup and the Challenge Cup, and really how do they kind of fare against the elite sides in Europe. So when we look at that one, we'll start with the Champions Cup, and we'll bring kind of the first one in, and the first one that kind of got drawn out was Leinster against Toulon. Now, as a Leinster fan myself, I always have really bad memories of Leinster playing against Toulon, because again, it was one of those teams that they just couldn't get over the hump. But things have changed a little bit now. I don't know about you, but I find it very hard to really judge some of the teams this year, because they played 2 games in the Champions Cup, and then the rest of the games are pretty much cancelled. The way it was done, if you were one of the unlucky teams that had a COVID outbreak, you lost 28-0. I guess before we go into kind of the Leinster and Toulon game and what we think might actually happen and what are the kind of key areas of that matchup is, how have you felt when you've been watching the Champions Cup and Challenge Cup this year? Because for me, seeing some of the top teams lose 28-0, because look, I think Toulon had one of those games against the Scarlets where there was a small COVID outbreak in the Toulon camp and they lost 28-0. What do you feel about this when you see some of these teams that you would expect to be the ones winning pretty much every game and they lose automatically 28-0?
Yeah, it's a tough one, because you see now in the Six Nations, France, the Scotland game had to be rescheduled, and if that was a Champions Cup game, Scotland would have won that game 28-0, but it's Six Nations and, revenue is everything, so that game will go ahead. So the inconsistency is the tough thing for fans. Is it fair if a team gets a COVID outbreak, they lose 28-0? Probably not, but again, it's unprecedented times. Schedules are very, tough to reschedule, and I can see why they do it. You're totally right, though. It is tough to get a real good grasp on what teams are actually like. I think this round, especially the next round, you'll probably see into the quarterfinal stage, you're going to see the best teams sort of, come to the top. But yeah, you just don't know really. And even the lack of crowds, Munster have a home game against Toulouse, and normally, a packed out Thomond, you're going to give Munster a really good chance. But, the Thomond factor, is it the same without the crowd? It's really not. So it is tough. If you're one of those teams that have a really good atmosphere and a really good home crowd, and you're at home for this round, you really don't see that advantage. Like Connacht have won 5 away on the bounce, and that's, if those games had full crowds at them, would they have won 5 in a row? I don't think so. So it does make a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I know it's been limited amount of games, but I was just kind of looking at some of the Toulon and Leinster games, and I know they've really only played. Toulon basically played one game in the Champions Cup where they played against the Sharks, and they won 26-14. You had Leinster against Montpellier, where Leinster won 35-14. Then obviously there was the little COVID outbreak for Toulon, where they were forced to lose the game 28-0. And then you saw Leinster beat Northampton 35-19. So, but then you look at the two teams, and I know Toulon haven't been to that level they were kind of previously. Like, for me, I always look back in those teams when it was towards the end of the career of like Johnny Wilkinson and stuff when he was at Toulon. It was a very difficult team to kind of take down, and it was kind of at the age of where all the money started going through kind of the top 14 in France. And it's a difficult one, but you look at some of the names that are on the Toulon team, and you just have to look at Mananu. You have Sergio Parise, Espet from South Africa as well. And then one player that played really, really well against Sharks when I was kind of looking back over that was Carbonell. So when you look at these two teams, it's a lot of internationals coming up against each other. How do you see this going? Do you think it is one of those where Leinster have that advantage because just the way they've been playing, and it's been very kind of consistent for a long time for Leinster? Or do you think that this is going to be a very close game between kind of two teams with a lot of kind of star players out there?
Yeah, I see it going probably a lot of the way the Leinster games have kind of been going, where it's close for a half at least, maybe even 50, 60 minutes, and then just the relentless pressure that Leinster seem to put out to teams will eventually crack. But look, this is not a Pro 14 team. This is Toulon, and you've already named some of the incredible players they have. And, you know, the bench, obviously, you know, players that might not be overly well known, maybe they are, but, you know, there's probably still superstars as well. So it's very hard to judge. It really is coming into this. I expect Leinster to do enough and get through. I just think they'll have enough of, it very much depends on if they can implement their game plan and what they like to do, which is just break teams down phase after phase after phase. And it's very tough to defend that, as we see week in, week out in the Pro 14. And Leinster have such a depth. Like even their second team is incredibly talented. So I do expect them to get through. But what do you think as a Leinster fan? Do you think he's have enough?
Yeah, I think they should win the game. It'd be very interesting to see the team that is selected for this game, because I think you're getting to a point of where it's very hard to not play the likes of Scott Penny in some of these big games because he's just been that good. You look at some of his performances. Look, you're getting a lot of players back as well. The biggest thing that Leinster have now is they do have a lot of depth in that squad, but the problem I think Leinster have is the same problem that Ireland are going to have, is what is the succession plan to Johnny Sexton? Because, look, right now he's fit and available, but we don't know what's going to happen. There's still the Scotland game, there's the England game, which are going to be two really kind of physically demanding games. And then pretty quick after that, you have this big game against Toulon. So it's an interesting one to see what's going to happen there, because we've seen the likes of Ross Byrne, we've seen Harry Byrne recently play for Leinster. Both have played quite well. And it's kind of what you said there. Even the second team, you're seeing some standout players. And that's what you want to see when you do have that second kind of group out there. You want to see somebody kind of step up and take charge, someone that you can potentially see taking over from a different position. Look, it's the reason why we're seeing some of the young players kind of be slowly put through the system in Ireland to kind of get them training with the team. And look, we saw Ryan Baird get to play against Italy, and there's going to be others that we'll be talking about, I know, when we talk about some of the other provinces. But I think that's the interesting one, is when do some of these younger players that have played very well actually get into the side? So with that, I kind of move on to the second kind of Irish clash in terms of the Champions Cup with Munster and Toulouse. And this is the one that when I saw the draw, it was one that you really want to watch this game, because the talent on both sides is really good. Because you look at Munster and they've played quite well this season. Some games that you look at them and it's been quite slow. But then other games, you look at them and they actually are picking up the pace, and it's the type of game you want to see Munster play. And look, obviously the important storyline from this week is that Joey Carberry is going to be pretty much starting his first game, which is, it's great news as both an Irish fan and just being able to watch this game in particular.
Yeah, 100%. This is, I've mentioned already, but it's a real shame that this won't have a full stadium and a full crowd, because it would be electric. Yes, Munster, Carberry back is fantastic, as you said, for not just Munster fans, but Irish fans. I think we are all very scared watching him play now. We're just hoping that he's okay and that he can at least, get a few games under his belt. And Munster have never this season, they haven't wowed me. They've never really played a game where I was like, wow, that was incredibly impressive by Munster, but they're still winning and they're still grinding out wins, which is what great Munster teams do. And what great Munster teams never really ran you off the pitch. They sort of just bullied you and broke you down until you gave up, and that's what the great teams do. And they have Munster starting 15 and starting 23 are good enough to win this game, but Toulouse are star-studded, and Intimac is back on the bench this week for France, so he's going to be back available for that team. You've got Dupont, you've got Ches and Colby. Like, these aren't average players. So
yeah,
watching them against Munster, I fear it could be a step too much for Munster. We'll see. I hope I'm wrong. Obviously, I'd love to see the Irish provinces win, but Toulouse are one of those teams, and it's a very French team. They don't need to play well for 80 minutes to win games. They just need 3 or 4 moments of magic, which they have several players capable of doing that. And then they have 28 points up on the board, and you're like, what the hell happened? We've played well in this game. But Munster will rely massively on their maul, their pack. Their pack needs to have a big game. Carberry back. Carberry might be that missing link that they might play a bit more expansive or a bit more creative with him, and that will bring the more likes of Dale Ende into it and Andrew Conway and the likes. So I think it might be just a step too much, but who knows? Yeah,
it's an interesting one because look, you mentioned some of them there. You have even, what was it, Kano as well.
Kano, yeah.
Yeah, like when I was looking at some of the names on just from their game earlier in the Champions Cup, I'm like, you would expect this to be like a Crusaders type team. That it's just full of stars. You tend to forget, like when you mentioned that Ches and Kobe is in that squad as well. And I think back to kind of the 2 group games they played, what was it, 2 years ago now against Leinster. Both of them were ridiculously like high quality games. But you're right. I think Munster need to try and make sure they can play this game to their strengths. I guess the one advantage is you look at just how good Ty Burns been playing over kind of the last couple of weeks. We were mentioning it prior to the Six Nations, is will he be able to put his Munster performances in for Ireland, and he's been doing that. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. Look, Toulouse are top of the top 14 in France, and that's a very difficult league to be winning in because, look, we've seen it with both the Champions Cup and even in the Challenge Cup. There's a lot of quality sides in France, and it's just going to be it's a tough one, I think, for Munster. I think what they need to do is they're going to need it to be one of those kind of scrappy games where it's low scoring, because if Toulouse are able to expand that game and kind of get that pace going, it's going to be difficult for Munster to kind of keep up with that. And like you said, it takes 5 minutes for Toulouse to put 21 or 28 points on you, and that's against like top teams as well. So if Munster aren't quite clicking at the time, they need to make sure that let's just hope for Munster's sake it's not a great day when they're playing. That'll definitely help.
Wins. Yeah, definitely would help.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Look, they're the 2 kind of the Irish provinces. Now I think we've spoken a load over time about Munster and Leinster. We know kind of where they're at, but you look at some of the other fixtures that actually came up, and just kind of we look at the kind of, we've spoken about the French teams. One of the other interesting ones is Lyon, where they get to play against Exeter. Now, Exeter are another one of these teams that you look at their side, and it's actually surprising when you look at the Premiership and the fact that they're not first, which just tells you just how good Bristol have been this season. But again, it's one of those teams that you expect to be there towards the end. They're just that good.
Yeah, 100%. Exeter, they're even like a better version of Leinster at just relentlessly shoving the ball down your face, and there's not really much you can do about it. And French teams aren't exactly known for they're more known for their flair and creating moments of magic rather than, defending for 80 minutes and, hanging on. So I think Exeter will have too much in this. And I'd love to see an Exeter-Leinster in the next round, which is possible, which would be fantastic. I was chatting with one of my mates today, actually, and he said it's either going to be 6 points to 3 or it's going to be 45-42. Like, there's no in between in that game. It's going to be, a movable object up against an unstoppable force. Leon, look, again, any French team like that, as you said, all the squads are loaded. So you just don't know. Like, they could show up and have one of those games and Exeter are out, and that would be incredible. But, Exeter are one of these teams, a bit like Ulster, who have benefited massively from not having as many stars as you would think on international duty. Like Simmons is there. So they will have a lot of cohesiveness. There's a lot of synergy there. A lot of, they're very used to playing with each other. There's no swapping in and out really of players coming back. So they're not going to be, they're not going to miss a step. So I do, and a home game. So I imagine they'll romp through this, I would imagine, comfortably enough.
Yeah, I'd say so too. And just going back onto that point about the whole not having as many internationals out there, I think it's kind of crazy that they don't. When you look at some of the players, you just look at the two Simmons brothers, how they haven't been drafted into the English side is, especially in an English side that's been struggling of late, that they haven't been brought in. Look, one we'll talk about a little bit later on as well, especially because it kind of pertains to one of the Irish games, is how Marcus Smith as well hasn't been brought into the English side. It's a really interesting one, but when we look at some of these English sides, there's a lot of talent there, and I think Exeter are a perfect example. Like, you almost forget that the likes of Stuart Hogger are on that team as well. It is ridiculous. It almost looks like a team that would be in the top 14 in France. It's just loaded with superstars. And that's kind of what we're used to seeing. Look, you look at Lyon, and they haven't been doing that great this season. I think they're 7th in the top 14, but they're an interesting one. They still have some good players out there. You look at Matthew Bastereau is still with them. Like, when you look at him, I can't believe he's still kind of trucking around. Like, he's been going on for ages, especially for
he must be a prop at this stage, is he?
At this stage, especially the way he plays, like, yeah, when he was like 23 or 24, you're like, okay, this is going to be really tough to kind of get past. But now he still plays the same way that he did back then, and the fact that he's been able to stay relatively healthy is remarkable. But yeah, I guess there's a couple of other kind of matchups that, while they don't kind of I don't think they get fans excited straight away when you look at it. So the next one would have been Scarlets against Sale Sharks. So what I see from the Scarlets is very reminiscent of Wales in terms of they know how to win games, but they don't always do it in the prettiest of ways. And it's kind of similar for Sale, who, look, I don't know if it's the same for you, but growing up, watching Sale was actually really, really interesting. I remember Jason Robinson and stuff playing for them, and they were always an interesting team, and then they kind of fell off for a while. And to have them back in kind of this stage of the round of 16 in the Champions Cup is always good to see. Kind of some of those teams that you were used to doing quite well get back to it. But how do you see this one going? Because look, we know there's a lot of Welsh internationals that are there, slowly coming back from injuries, as we've seen with the Welsh team. But do you think that this is going to be, like we expect, kind of a bit of a slugfest, and it's going to be one of those where whatever team just is more kind of disciplined on the day probably gets the win?
Yeah, I think if it comes down to discipline, I can see Scarlets nicking it. I think these are one of those games where the weather, like we said, could be massive. I think if this is a sluggish pitch and the rain's coming in sideways, I think it suits Scarlets. Sale, I think, would rather a much more quick kind of paced game. I think that could make a massive difference. But look, Wales are, but somehow they're 3-0 in the Six Nations. There's confidence back in some of their players. I'm sure it trickles down. So you never know. Scarlets are by no means, one of the best teams in this competition. They're not, but they're still there. And, with Welsh teams, they're never going to bow out easily. So Sale need, big games from their big players, which I'm sure they'll get. But this is such as they call it, a pick'em. I just don't know who's going to come out on top of this. But it's one of those games, like you said, it doesn't, when you see it on paper, you're not going to be like, oh, I can't wait to watch that. But I guarantee if you watch it, you'd be entertained the whole game.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the interesting thing that I always liked about the Champions Cup, and I don't know if it's the same about you, but like literally it was a Saturday and all Sunday just watching rugby match after rugby match. It's always, what I used to love is the last game of the pool stages where you were seeing what teams were getting knocked out of that top 8, I think it was, who was going to be playing against who. Look, unfortunately we didn't get that this season because of COVID, but again, I guess that just makes some of these matchups a little bit more interesting because we don't really know what to expect from some of these teams because we haven't seen them as much. I guess that brings us to the next one. And again, it comes to a side that you're used to seeing good rugby from, but again, have slowly dipped over the last few years in Clermont, where you go back to maybe 6 or 7 years ago and you're expecting them to be in semi-finals and finals pretty much every single year. They still have some of the same names there. Morgan Parra still floating around at Clermont. To be honest, I'm surprised Rougerie is still not playing. It seemed like he played for about 20 years for Clermont. Yeah. But this is an interesting game because you kind of look at it. Neither team has really dominated in their leagues. Like Clermont are 4th in the top 14. I think Wasps are 9th in the Guinness or in the Premiership. But again, the two styles of teams here actually really fit to get a really exciting game.
Yeah, it's two again, a game where it's very hard to predict. Like, it's great, first of all, to see Wasps back at this level. They were off the face of the planet for a long time, and then they're back now at the top table, which is great. Clermont, as you said, it's kind of one of the giants of Europe, and then sort of in a dip of form now, but still thereabouts, and on their day, as we know, could beat probably anybody if it all clicks. So it's one of those games. I'm looking forward to watching it because I have no idea really what will happen. But again, it could be one of those moments where you don't want to miss the game because there's nothing worse than you don't watch one of the games and then one of your mates texts you being like, "Are you watching the Wasp Clermont game?" Because it's unbelievable, and then you're like, "Shit, I didn't bloody watch it." So that could be Wasp home advantage could play a part even without the crowd. You never know. French team has to travel, so and it's not like traveling in normal 8 times with COVID. I'm sure traveling is even more of a pain. So it's tough. How do you see that one going yourself?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Like, I've seen Clermont the odd time this season in top 14, and when they've actually won games, and it hasn't been the same style that you would have expected Clermont to win games in. In terms of Wasps, like you said, they're a really interesting team to kind of come back, having the likes of Feketawa be there for them as well. It's one that, like I mentioned previously, I think the style of this game is going to be probably the most interesting. The only thing I think that might get it into Clermont's favour is, again, we mentioned it with the Scarlets and the Sale Sharks game, is they just know how to win. And that's where the fact that Wasps haven't been at this stage for a while, I just think that might be enough. I usually don't go on that in terms of the group games, but when it comes to kind of knockout rugby, that's where you want those teams that really know how to win. We're seeing it in the Six Nations at the moment. You look at the Welsh team, and look, we can probably say they've been lucky in a couple of the games, but the one thing that you can say for them in the Scotland and England game is they stayed in the game the whole way through. And when the tide started to shift, look, obviously the Scotland game was because of the red card, but they were in position to go and win that game. And the same for the game against England. And I see the same for Clermont, is they know how to win rugby matches. And I think that's the biggest difference. going from Clermont to probably one of the more impressive teams in the top 14 this year in La Rochelle. Look, a lot of us kind of follow how they do because of obviously Ronan O'Gara is their head coach. But you look at a Gloucester team that you look at the actual side and you expect them to do really well, but then you actually go and look at them in the Premiership and they've fared pretty poorly this season. So you look at it now, I think Gloucester are 11th in the Premiership, which you wouldn't have thought. I think the one game that kind of stood out to me was the one against Ulster, where I expected a little bit more. I know a lot of things happened at that stage. I know, wasn't it to do with Danny Cipriani, who his contract was just suddenly he decided to not even negotiate with the club and wanted to leave. So I know they went through a bit of turmoil, but the La Rochelle team, while it's not household names that we're used to seeing in kind of top 14, they're one of the more interesting sides to actually watch. Like I said, it comes back to styles. They're one of the teams that when I watch over in France, they're one of the more interesting sides to actually watch, probably apart from Toulouse. And it's the reason why they're second in the top 14.
Yeah, I think obviously the O'Gara factor is massive when you're kind of following La Rochelle, just because I think a lot of people kind of see him as a possible future Irish coach because he's worked with some of the best clubs in the world and he's spent time with Crusaders and he's gone about his business very well and, going to teams, learning from the best, taking on, his own team now with La Rochelle and started off rocky, but now it's coming, good. I think their defensive record is just insane for a league like the top 14, where, as we said, these powerhouses of teams having the best defensive record is an incredible feat. So it's a case of, is that good enough then when you come into a European competition with Gloucester, who, as we said, not having the best year, but still very talented players. I would say it is enough. I think when your defense is good, it really forces other teams' attack to be really clinical. And as we've seen from Gloucester this year, that just hasn't been the case. So and obviously just because of the O'Gara factor, I'd like to see La Rochelle. And I haven't seen a lot of their games. I've seen results, but I haven't actually seen a lot of their actual playing. So to actually watch them and hope they continue throughout the tournament, it'd be interesting to watch them and see how they play. Again, selfishly because of O'Gara and seeing how a team under him is prepared, how they play, how they go about, if plan A isn't working, do they have a plan B? How quick are they to change to it? Stuff like that if he is to go on and take on that Ireland job and God, how long that is, it'll be good to see that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I always like the way La Rochelle's come this season. You mentioned the defensive record. I always put that down to one of the big positives from a coach, because if you can get a team, especially in top 14, playing really, really good defensively, your systems are working, and that's something that you can kind of build off. So it is. I've always followed O'Gara's kind of his career. I know, kind of starting early in France, going to Crusaders, and now getting the chance to be a head coach. It's good to see how he kind of goes on. I would like to see him remain as kind of head coach somewhere, even if it is at La Rochelle for a couple of years before getting that Irish job. So then he'll be prepared, because look, it would be nice to have someone come in that knows the players in terms of the Irish job, but also knows the opposition. That's a really, really important one. And he's always been someone, even as an analyst, when I would watch, that you do actually learn quite a bit from, because he does kind of pick out certain points of the game, and it shows you just how smart he is as kind of a rugby person. So yeah, it's going to be a really interesting one. Like I said, Gloucester not been in the best form this season, but you look at some of the players there, and they, on their day, they could beat anybody. And then La Rochelle, if their systems work, if their defense kind of holds up and it allows a bit more creativity in the attack, you could see La Rochelle go through. And like you said, for selfish reasons, I hope they do go through, because it would be nice to see it, more than just see how O'Gara kind of treats kind of a quarterfinal or a semi-final in a major European competition, see kind of what is his coaching style when it comes to those really big pressured games. the last two games are interesting for me because of two teams. Now, I feel like these are fairly straightforward ones to know who's probably going to win. Now, the first one is Racing against Edinburgh. Look, while Racing haven't been like the favourites over kind of the last couple of years, you still look at that squad and it's still ridiculous. And it's one of those, they're fifth this year in top 14. Now, you probably would have expected a little bit more, and there's some of those names there. But when you look at Edinburgh, they've also struggled this season. And I know there's been a difference because we're seeing kind of some players be able to play, others not. I just, personally, I don't think Edinburgh are quite there yet as a whole side to be able to go up against one of these kind of big French teams and actually pull up the upset. I don't know if you agree with that, but right now I think Racing will probably have a little bit too much for Edinburgh to get through that tie.
Yeah, 100%. They just have too much firepower, and it's nothing against Edinburgh, but Racing, as we said, like a lot of other teams, it only has to click 2 or 3 times a game and they're in, they'll score a try, where Edinburgh, they sort of have to play a flawless game here to get the win. And Racing are, they've had so many final defeats now that you have to imagine that even from the get-go here, they're going to be very much up for these games, trying to prove a point. And I hope they do. Part of me would love to see them win just because of the Irish connections there, obviously. But to see a team lose that many times in the final, it's not fun to see or fun to watch. So I think Edinburgh are not a terrible team, and the Scottish team at the moment is one of the most impressive Scottish teams I've seen in a long time. So again, that has to trickle down to their international players. So I think it'll just be maybe a year or two too soon for Edinburgh, but to good things to come. But Racing, too much firepower.
Yeah, and look, then the last kind of game in terms of the Champions Cup, and you actually look at these games as a whole, and I think the draw has been very kindly for neutral fans to be able to watch some of these games, because you even have Bordeaux and Bristol, which again, you have Halibert for Bordeaux, which is always an interesting one to see how he'll get on. But then, like, you look at Bristol and they're flying in the Premiership. We were just mentioning just how good Exeter were and some of the players that they have, but for Bristol to be top and really to be playing the way they are, it's hard to see past Bristol at the moment just by how good they have played over the last couple of months.
Yeah, it's tough. Bordeaux, Jalibert is one of those players who really surprised me, because I seen him last year playing, and he'd all the good attributes of a grade 10, but then he also had that Finn Russell sort of throw a pass that isn't on, and then it's intercept try. He had the clanger in his locker, but he seems to have really cut that out this year. I don't want to jinx him, but the first few games for France, he's been very, very impressive, and he hasn't made those mistakes. He's sort of reined that in, and he's only 21, 22. It's not as if he's a mature adult at this stage. He still has plenty of years to do that. But Bristol has, obviously Bristol with the Pat Lam, a lot of Connacht players have gone over recently. Now Stephen Cairns has gone over for 4 weeks on a loan. So that connection's there as well. And, Pat Lam is one of those coaches I'd love to see take over Ireland at some stage. I think would be incredible for us. Whether that's going to happen or not, I doubt it. But this will be a game now that I will be watching intently, because just for the names and then the style of play, it's just going to be it should be one of the games actually of the first round. Yeah,
I completely agree. I think it's one of those that we mentioned, like the amount of games you look at here and it's just firepower kind of going up against each other. And this is another one. And like I said, maybe the fact that we haven't had a lot of games in the Champions Cup has actually worked out, that a lot of these top teams have gotten through, and there hasn't been as many kind of surprises, where you look at pretty much each one of these matchups and there's a lot to actually look forward to individually in some of these games. But like you said, the Bordeaux and Bristol game I think it's one of those that it's must watch rugby. But then the one thing that I struggle with is when a lot of people say, well, they'll watch all the Champions Cup and then they'll ignore a lot of the games in the Challenge Cup, when there's actually some really interesting games this season. Look, I picked out 2 of kind of the Irish ones that we're going to pay attention to, and you actually look at it and they're 2 of the kind of noteworthy games anyway. So the first one, Leicester against Connacht, that's a tough draw that came in there for Connacht. It's always tough to have to go over to England and to play against, especially a Leicester side that's been doing decent enough. But you look at, even like we said, some of the names that they have on that side, they're going to be a really tough outfit to beat. But like we said, we've seen some really impressive performances this season from Connacht, and you're starting to see them improve as time goes on. And like we mentioned at the start of the show, it's what we need. We need all 4 provinces really battling towards kind of being competitive in European competition.
Yeah, I think my Connacht friends were saying before the draw, the last thing they want is an away game in England, and that's exactly what they got. But this is the first time they've played Leicester in Europe, so there's no previous record of terrible results. So that's one thing. But look, Connacht are amazingly inconsistent this year, and that's unfortunately been their downfall. A lot of games, like they bet Leinster, they played fantastic last weekend against Munster. Their good is very good, and it's good enough to beat a Leicester and go on and can actually compete for this Challenge Cup. But the problem is they also have performances like Ospreys this year and recently against Benetton, where it took a last-second try to get over the line, where it's very infuriating watching these games because you know how good they can be, the likes of Jack Carty and Bundy Aki, where their best is really, really good. But then some days it just isn't there and they don't show up, and that's the problem. We just don't know what Connacht's going to show up at the moment. Their away record, like I touched on earlier on, is incredible. 5 wins in a row away from home, which is a club record. They signed or announced today 21 extensions from their squad with mostly big names, only 1 or 2 names that haven't been mentioned yet. So that's a positive thing. They're going in with momentum and there's no contract hawk hanging over their head. But this is, I was at the Connacht press conference this week, and Dennis Buckley was chatting, and he said that they are viewing this as a very winnable trophy, and they should be, because they are good enough to beat any team in this. The problem is what Connacht is going to show up.
Yeah, that's the problem. Is when you look at in any European competition, you need consistency, and if you don't have that, it's tricky, and especially with, like we said, having to go away to an English side is fairly difficult, and unfortunately that's just the way the draw is. But look, if you're going to win this competition, you're going to have to beat those sides anyway. So if I have to put you on the spot, is what type of Connacht do you think actually shows up against Leicester? Do you think it's going to be the one where we've seen them play against the likes of Leinster and be really, really impressive and beat Leinster? Or do you think we're going to get more close to the inconsistent play, which could end up costing them the game?
I think it'll be a good Connacht. The reason I say that is because against the big teams this year, they have shown up. Like Leinster, like I said, like Carty was the best player on the pitch that day, and he seems to be one of those players where the tougher the opposition, the better he plays. So they will be up for this game. Andy Friend's a fantastic coach. He's going to have them raring to go for this. I think we will get a good performance from them, and I think they will win. And the fact that if they do get through, they will be home to either Ospreys or Newcastle, that's a real, incentive to get through that first round, because then you have a home quarterfinal, and then you're into a semi-final, and then you're only 2 games away from silverware. So it's all about getting over this game, but that I do think they will show up, and I do think they will do enough to beat them. Yeah,
it's an interesting one if they do that, if they're able to beat Leicester, and then you see the likes of the Ospreys to have to come in. Is can they kind of not play down to the opposition like we've seen them? Like you look at you just mentioned it with Carty there, that when he's playing against the good teams, he seems to rise to the occasion. Then when it's kind of one of the poorer sides that comes in and he doesn't play as well, that's going to be an interesting track to see. Well, if they do get over that hump, if they do beat Leicester, how will they play in that next round if it is Newcastle or if it's the Ospreys? I guess then the last kind of Irish side that we'll talk about is the Ulster game, because that's going to be a really interesting one. Them against Harlequins, I think, could be one of the games of that kind of round of 16, especially in the Challenge Cup, because I mentioned earlier, Harlequins have been kind of really, really good in terms of the attacking side of their game this season. I mentioned earlier with Marcus Smith, who personally I'm really surprised hasn't been put in the English setup. He's been that good. But then you look at Ulster, and they're very much that sometimes I watch them and I'm really impressed with how they play. And there's other games that I watch Ulster and I feel like I wasted about an hour of my time watching them play. Like it's a really interesting one because you look at them earlier on in the season and they were flying. They were winning pretty much every single game in the Pro 14 until I think they lost to Leinster at the time. But then you look at even, what was it, last week against Leinster and the ill discipline. Like I know there was a lot of officiating decisions that we won't go into, but the problem is if you do go down to kind of 14 men or 13, it's a killer in these type of games. So just have to go back to the Gloucester game. Like they were lucky to kind of get through the first half there where they went down to, I think it was either 14 or 13 men. They need to be able, their discipline has to be very good in this game, because if it's not, Harlequins are that good to where they can get through you fairly quickly and they can put up the score by the time you get back to 15.
Yeah, Ulster, I think when they have a yellow card, they concede an average of 12 points, which has to be one of the highest in the league. So that can't happen. You're right, this is Europe. You can't have a sloppy day at the office. You will be punished, whereas maybe some games, the Pro 14, you won't be. Ulster are really good. Again, when they're clicking and everything's working, they are incredibly good. Like watching that first 10 minutes against Leinster, they were just delightful to watch. They really were. Of all the provinces, when they have good, quick, go forward ball from the ruck, they're the best province to watch. They have that firepower. Yeah. Balakoon's back. He looks like an absolute superstar. James Hume looks incredible when he's on his, on form. McCluskey is one of those players I kind of wanted to see more of, and I haven't seen it. I think for the size of a man he is, he doesn't really break enough ground or make enough ground, but he's still a very decent player. The problem is with Ulster, they're so reliant on Coetzee to really be a ball carrier for them. And we've seen in games where he's had to go off either injured or substitution or even yellow card, the performance really drops and their pack really lose. It's understandable. He's a fantastic player. He's a world-class player. There's a reason he's going back to South Africa, is because he's aiming for that international team. So he wouldn't be doing that if he didn't see that being a possibility, or at least he's being told it's a possibility. Nick Timoney, though, has come on. He's fantastic. David McCann is a youngster down there that they're really tied very highly. Their props and their hookers are all international standards, so they are good enough to win this game, but they are quite reliant on a few members of the team performing well, and that's my only issue. If Coetzee, God forbid, goes off injured or picks up a nick before the game, he is that important that he could swing a game for them.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've always kind of been critical of Ulster over the years, is they've had some very, very good players, but sometimes they've been over-reliant on it. You look at even back to when Ulster got into, what was it, the Heineken Cup at that stage, the final, where they were so kind of reliant on Ruan Pienaar as well. It's a tricky one. Going back to kind of that Leinster and Ulster game for Balakoon, I can't believe that try was disallowed. It was one of the best. It's one of the best tries over the past, I'd say, couple of weeks anyway. And it was unfortunate, and look, this coming from a Leinster fan, that it was that it was disallowed. It was that good. But having him come back and playing the way he is not only really good for Ulster, it's actually really good for Ireland, because he's someone that I'd like to see, especially when it comes to the autumn internationals. Or I don't know if the tour is going to happen in the summer. I know they haven't announced anything yet, but he'd be an interesting one to see, to kind of slowly be brought in if you're going to play a couple, especially if the Lions tour actually goes ahead. If you have a couple of players that are out and you're still planning on touring with the Irish side, it'd be good to see some of these younger players come through, because look, we'll be talking about them over the next couple of months anyway, but he's one definitely to be looking out for. And kind of with that, moving kind of towards this weekend. So we'll start with the Sunday game between Ireland and Scotland. Obviously, overall, it's been a fairly disappointing Six Nations for Ireland. The first two games, performance-wise, hasn't really been up there in terms of their attacking creativity. Obviously, you saw a little bit more of that against Italy, but again, it's Italy, and like we've seen the same thing with England, is when they needed to kind of rectify a few things, that Italian game came at the right time. But then again, they come out against Wales and look flat again. So do you expect to see anything different from Ireland this weekend? Because if you actually look at how the two sides have played, you'd probably put Scotland as favourites to win the game at the weekend.
Yeah, definitely. As I said before, Scotland are playing some great stuff. If they didn't get that red card against Wales, I firmly believe they would have went on to win that comfortably. Do I expect Sydney to do different? No, I don't. I think if you do, after watching this Irish team over the last couple of years, I think you're foolish to expect anything different. It's a shame, like this, as you said, this Six Nations a throwaway at this stage. They can't. They could probably finish third or whatever like that financially. I'm sure that's an incentive to them. But I've always been told that they couldn't use Six Nations as a chance to try something new or blood new players, and then this year really was the perfect chance to do that because of it was never going to be a good year financially anyway. So to do it this year would have made sense. Now, after 3 games, you've lost 2. You've got Scotland and England, 2 games left, 2 very losable games as well as winnable games. It would have been a good time to maybe bring something new in. But Andy Farrell, look, you can't really blame Andy Farrell in a lot of ways. His job is on the line here. Whether a win against Scotland and England is good enough, it probably would be to keep his job, especially against England. But there's nothing I've seen. I think Stockdale was the only player that got brought in. Shane Daly, in fairness, was injured, so Stockdale got brought back up. That's the only change in the squad. So I can't imagine you're going to see anything different in terms of play style. I think Italy game, you're 100% right, flattered us. Italy were very poor defensively. The one thing I did see that I liked against Italy was we weren't taking the ball static from rucks. We were taking it coming on to pace. Whether that was because we knew it was against Italy and we could get away with that, I don't know whether we'll see it against Scotland. But Finn Russell was on a podcast yesterday and he was asked, is he surprised that Ireland have struggled in these first few games? And he said no, that they're very rigid and they're very systematic in what they do. And when opposition are saying that about you, it's not a good thing. So I don't know. If we lose both these games, will it finally be the kick in the ass that Ireland need to maybe change things? I don't know. I genuinely don't know at this stage.
Yeah, it's been one of the questions I've had very, very often in a lot of the podcasts when I've had different people on that would look at Ireland from the outside, and it's very similar to that in terms of they are rigid in their system, but it's difficult to kind of look at this, and if Ireland don't win against Scotland and they don't win against England, it's really hard for a fan base to then go on and really have belief in a coaching staff that you haven't really seen much from. That when the Six Nations was on the line last season, or not really last season, a couple of months ago now, they crumbled. We've seen it happen. There's a lack of creativity, and what annoys me most is you actually look at the players and just how good that they can play. Like you look at some of even the backs for Leinster, and when they play for Leinster, they play completely different to when they play for Ireland. It's one of those that it begs the question, what's going on? Are they too rigid in terms of their systems? Because you look at Leinster, they have their systems in place, both attack and defence. But there is that room for creativity. And that's something that I see is severely lacking with Ireland, is that exactly how they're going to play. When early on in Joe Schmidt's kind of tenure as Ireland coach, you thought you knew how they were going to play. But then they'd come up and they do something completely different. Like we saw, they play a completely different way against England than you'd see them play against Wales, or you didn't expect to see the level of performance against New Zealand those 3 or 4 times that we played them. And that's just something that I feel is missing, that I don't know if it's the belief or if it is actually the coaching. Personally, I am never one to believe that when you're making a change as a head coach, that you bring somebody that's already been in the previous regime. Because again, for me, I feel like if you're making a change, you should make a change for the entire coaching staff, because you don't want players to be too comfortable. And I think that's probably one of the main criticisms right now, is that a lot of players probably are too comfortable, and the coaching staff is as well, because like we said this season, this was the perfect time to look at new players that you might want to bring in and kind of establish as international players. The one thing I always look at Joe Schmidt is he was never afraid to do that. You looked at the likes of Dan Levy very early on in his career, didn't play much for Ireland. He was brought in and he was excellent when he first started. You saw the same. Look, James Ryan was excellent for Leinster already, but I don't see enough of that from Farrell at the moment, and I feel like that's what we need to kind of get to. Unfortunately for him, I think he's coming up against two very good teams in the next couple of weeks that I think in a normal season, if he loses both the games, he probably doesn't survive it. But I wonder, with everything that's gone on with COVID and how he probably wouldn't have been around this side as much as he would have wanted, if that kind of delays the decision. It's a really interesting one as we kind of look forward. In terms of when you look at that, is what would you do if, let's say, the worst thing happens and Ireland lose both games? What would you want the IRFU to kind of do? Would you prefer to move on, bring in a new coach, or would you allow kind of Farrell to kind of still try and help develop this side over the next 12 months?
It is really tough because I'm one of the extremists in a lot of ways. As in, like, I'd love to bring in, like I said earlier on, like a Pat Lam or something like that. Do you know what I mean? That would totally change our philosophy. I had this discussion before, and the IRFU, they look at this as a business, so they don't really care who's in the squad, who's not in the squad. You know what I mean? They care about, you know, making enough money to survive and whatnot, and that's understandable. But it's also not ideal when you're there in control of, you know, controlling the Irish international team. Is Andy Farrell? I strongly believe that Andy Farrell, if they had waited a year after announcing Andy Farrell, I don't think Andy Farrell would have got the job. He was named a year before Schmidt actually left, and that was a pretty poor year for us. And Andy Farrell was already named as the, you know, successor. I don't think Andy Farrell's a poor coach. He's been on Lions, you know, staffs. He's clearly good at what he does. Is he possibly out of his depth for international head coaching role? That's possible too. But he's also in a shitty situation where, you know, the team isn't performing. Whether that's down to him and his coaching staff, it's very possible. Like Mike Catt came out and said that, you know, he's not telling players what to do. They have the freelance to do what they want. But if anyone has watched Billy Burns play any rugby for Ulster, getting the ball off a stolen line out and kicking an up and under on the halfway line is not what Billy Burns does, and it's not what's made him good enough to be on the Irish team. So I don't buy that for a second. So I don't like that side of things, almost blaming the players. Paul O'Connell has been a good addition. He's done well and brought in. So not everything has been terrible. I just think Ireland has, a lot of the rugby world has been consumed about this kicking game and how it's worked for teams like South Africa and England, and they've all been, Ireland especially has thought that, okay, if it works for these teams, you know, we should do it too. But it's not working to our strengths. You've mentioned the Leinster backs. We brought James Lowe in, who's one of the best attacking players in Europe, and we've made him into a kicking winger. Like, how are we expecting to get the best from our teams when we're doing this sort of stuff? It's brainless. Like, we're just so obsessed with what other teams are doing. We're not really focusing on what makes us good and the strengths of our players. Like, Billy Byrne is an attacking fly half. He's not making him kick up and unders for people to contest is just a waste of his talents. And I get the whole an international team, you know, it's what team makes the least mistakes. But as we've just spent the last half an hour talking about the French teams, it only has to click 4 or 5 times for that team, and they've scored 4 or 5 tries. You know, why don't we try to, you know, it doesn't have to work for 80 minutes for those teams. Do you know what I mean? Like, they run that risk, but more than likely it's going to work, and they can beat any team on any day. I'd love if Ireland, you know, some days it's not going to work and you might lose to a Scotland or Wales, but what if that one day it clicks and you bet New Zealand? That's what I would like Ireland to go down the line towards. Whether that's Andy Farrell is the man for that job, I don't think he is. The IRFU don't care what I think and aren't thinking along the lines that I'm thinking of. So that's, you know, they're just going to look at it as like, if we finish third, that's a pretty good financial season for us. Let's try and do that every year. And that's the real shame of it. But I don't like going on the lines of calling for people's jobs. He signed a contract until the World Cup, I believe. He is in contract till the World Cup. So they might just, see that contract out and see what happens, bring him to a World Cup. But if they did, like he signed that contract extension last year, I believe, I'd love if the IRFU gave him the power to do whatever he wants. And I mean like whatever he wants. So that is a case of sacrificing a few games for what he thinks is a better good going into a World Cup. I'd love if they did that, but they're never going to do that, unfortunately, because of the business side of things. And it's a shame in that sense, but sorry for the rant.
No, it's one of those that I think it's the conversation I think every household is having watching Ireland play, that people are wondering, like, when is this going to change? It's the same thing watching over and over and over again. And like you said, there's not really a light at the end of the tunnel because there's not enough change that's actually happening. Which look, I think any Irish fan can tell you that since maybe the last year or two of Joe Schmidt, change needed to happen, and like wholesale change needed to happen. There's really good players on all these provinces that haven't gotten a chance. You just have to look at some of the games when the internationals are on, and you see some of these young players. Like, I'm telling you that if this was the start of the kind of Joe Schmidt era in Irish rugby, you probably would see some of these young players that are currently playing for their provinces be given an opportunity already. Because I don't think he was as rigid early on in a starting 15. And right now, you can pretty much guess. The biggest thing that I look at is, you mentioned Billy Burns, which is a really good example. The other one that is, for me, it's crazy, as you mentioned it as well, is James Lowe. How he has just been turned into basically a kicking winger is ridiculous, because that's not even playing to his strengths. Okay, yeah, he has a good left foot because we don't have many players in our team that can kick with their left foot, but that's not what made him successful for Leinster. He's never going to be a top defensive winger. And I know a lot of people will criticize him for it. But if you're not playing him to his strengths, it's almost useless having him on the pitch, because he's there to be that difference maker, because that's what he did for Leinster for the past couple of seasons. And unfortunately, you're seeing him having to stay a lot deeper than we would want him to be. We want him being up there where he can receive the ball and get that bit of space. So, because if he beats one player, a lot of the time for Leinster, he was pretty much getting over, and we're not really seeing that side to his game. And you mentioned with Billy Burns, you watch him for Ulster, and he's always on like the front line. He's attacking. For Ireland, we're not seeing that. We're seeing him kind of more in that kind of deeper role. Kind of, I think what they need to remember is the likes of Billy Burns, he's not going to do the same things that Sexton likes to do. And because they're two completely different styles of players. And that's always the problem I've had, is I don't think we've ever, probably since early on in the Joe Schmidt era with Ireland, we've never actually played to our team strengths. And you look at the likes of the English side, other than this season, they always played to the strengths of their team. Now they've gone on the whole kicking side of things, and look what's happened to them. Just because one team in South Africa who do it excellently well doesn't mean that it's the only way to be successful at international rugby. I know a lot of people want to copy because you win a World Cup and everyone wants to copy that style, but it's not always that style that's going to win games. We can look through some of the Super Rugby in New Zealand that I've been watching over the past few weeks, and it's just attacking rugby, and it's thrilling to watch. And you look at one of those games, you're like, why can we not see more of that in the Irish setup? Because you look at some of the players and they're capable of playing in kind of high attacking ways, but I don't feel like we've been doing that over the last kind of couple of seasons. And look, this kind of brings me on to the Italy and Wales game. I think we know what we should expect in that game, with Wales getting a lot of players back. Italy have struggled. Wales is vying for that kind of Grand Slam. You'd expect them to win. the real game on the Saturday that we'll pay attention to is the England and France game. That's one that I hope England don't resort back to just the kicking game. They kind of go back to what they were successful at and actually using kind of that strength, that power, and also the athleticism of that back line. Like, we haven't seen enough from Watson or Johnny May over the last couple of weeks, when really prior to that, they were some of the standouts that you were expecting them to score in pretty much every single game. This could be, I think it's very similar to what you said with when Leinster could end up playing against Exeter in the next round, that this could be a really low scoring game or a really high scoring game. I'm hoping it's a high scoring game as a neutral, because look, England can't win the Grand Slam anyway now, so I don't mind actually watching them and seeing what a game against France is going to be like. But yeah, I'm hoping that we get to see a lot of the flair that we've seen from the French team already, but also that we kind of see a little bit better from England, because recently it's not even so much that, as an Irish fan, a lot of the time wanting them to lose, but it's disappointing to see such a good team play so poorly over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, it should be a great game. England, I totally agree. The best we've seen England actually was against Wales, when they were 2 scores down and they actually had to play some attacking rugby. And they played really nice, crisp stuff and they scored from it. They developed chances and they took advantage of those chances, and they didn't just revert back to trying to make Wales make mistakes. And that's what a lot of these teams are doing now, is trying to make the other team make mistakes. It's almost afraid to lose rather than trying to win. France, though, unfortunately, are one of those teams now that do both those things really, really well. So they are physical enough that they will, run up defensive line, smash you. Their fullback, Doolin, was incredible against Ireland. So if you're putting up big high balls, he's more than likely going to come down with it. But then they also have, Anton Dupont. They have, Jalibert, Intermax back from the bench. You've got an incredible back line. So they can do both. They can kill you in both ways, which is not what a lot of teams can do. I think, you make a good point that I think England will revert back to it, because look, this is unfortunately rugby. Like, we all have our biases and we all have our ideas of what's good with rugby, and these managers do too. So Eddie Jones he thinks that he knows everything about rugby, and he probably does know he obviously does know a lot about rugby, but he has his beliefs and he has his biases to what's going to work, and he still thinks that's the way to do it. Like, you made a good point, like Ireland trying to do the same thing South Africa does. When Ireland starts producing athletes like R.G. Snyman, I'll then believe that that's a good idea to do that kind of game style. And England has those players, would have told you, and France have those kind of athletes. We don't. But France, I think, the only thing I would say, France have had 2 weeks off now, whereas England only have had the 1. So there is, if it takes 20 minutes to get back up to speed for France, that could be a difference if England get out to a bit of a lead. But I still think France but if anyone wants to know what great rugby, France are the only team really in the Northern Hemisphere that are playing unbelievably good rugby. Just fantastic to watch, and the belief and taking risks and taking chances, it's fantastic to watch. So I would like to see France win the Grand Slam, just because I think that they deserve it. They might bring an end to this kick and shite that we keep seeing if they're very successful. So let's hope that they do win. And I like the way you're very political by saying you don't want England to lose. I want England to lose most weeks. So I'm comfortable in saying that. So I hope they do lose, but it should be a great game.
Yeah, like, we look, to be fair, and it is more of, I would like to see this be like a proper kind of attack-minded game. I don't want to see where one team's afraid not to go out and win the game. Like, if you looked at the England and France game, look, we've had some absolutely fantastic English and French games over the last couple of seasons, and hopefully we get that again. My worry is just the way England have wanted to play this season. It just hasn't been good. And look, I've talked to a lot of English fans about this, and a lot of them are getting fed up with kind of what Eddie Jones is doing and some of his decision making. And I agree, because we mentioned even within the Champions Cup and Challenge Cup, some of the really talented players that England have at their disposal and just don't use. So we can be mad at Irish fans of some of our players not coming through, but when you have kind of bona fide superstars in the Premiership not getting chances for the English side. Look, it's completely fair for people to be mad at kind of Eddie Jones. Like I said, I would probably agree with you. I would love to see France be able to have a chance to win the Grand Slam, and it sets up really well for that Welsh and French game, because that's one that if both teams have won, I know there's obviously the Scotland game that France will still have to play, but at that point in time, it'll be very interesting to see if what happens in that game, because that's two teams that normally you wouldn't think Wales would be kind of one of those that will come out and go for a game, but when you come against France, you kind of have to, because we saw it against Ireland. They had a real off day against us, but it was 3 or 4 really good plays, and suddenly Ireland are out of sight, and they can't get close to France. And but yeah, I think like you said, they're probably the most enjoyable team to watch, and it goes to show, like we mentioned, the Champions Cup and Challenge Cup, some of the teams that are in the round of 16 are frighteningly good, and it's no wonder considering they won the under-20s the World Cup, and we've seen this coming from France, and they've got the coaching staff together that works, and they've got the players now together that works, and they're building towards the World Cup. And that's always been my gripe with Ireland, is we never actually build towards a World Cup. France have done that, and you're starting to see kind of the fruits of that labor.
Yeah, 100%. That they do. They had a fairly poor team 2 years ago, and they said, okay, that's it. Let's bring in the young lads and let's see what they can do. And they benefited. Look, I know they have 14 teams in the top division in France to spread the talent across. I get that, but they still took the chance. They still brought these players in to give them a chance to excel, and they're seeing the fruits for it now. And it is fantastic to watch. Yeah,
absolutely. I guess the last thing that we'll just kind of quickly mention is, in terms, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, in terms of the Super Rugby. I've been kind of enthralled with a lot of the rugby in New Zealand, especially there was the first weekend for the Crusaders, and even just in the matchup 2 as well. You look at some of the attacking rugby, and it's ridiculously high speed, high intensity. The way I see them training over there is just at a different level. The way they want to do it, it's not just to be like the biggest and the strongest, it's to be the most athletic and powerful, and it's something that is really enjoyable to watch. I know I haven't had too much of a chance to watch Super Rugby in Australia yet, but look, with the rumours of it coming to kind of free TV, having more rugby on free TV, I'll definitely get to watch more of that. But again, I know you said to me off air that you have watched some of the Super Rugby over in New Zealand. What has your takeaways been from the kind of the first couple of weeks?
Yeah, if you look, it is behind the paywall, but if you can afford it, it is worth the money. Like, it's a different breed of rugby, and it's just so great to watch, because there's no boring segments of any games, and you have 5 teams, and all are really good teams. The Crusaders are like, they're like Leinster, but just
better.
Yeah, they would be more different type of style, but they are. Yeah. I would think if the two played, the Crusaders would have went on top, but like ruthlessly efficient. Like, they played Hurricanes at the weekend, and Hurricanes are a really good team. Hurricanes got a yellow card, and Crusaders scored 3 tries in that 10-minute period. They just took advantage. They knew how to hit you. They knew how to get it done. And look, they have superstars on every team, but Crusaders are a different level. They just keep producing year in, year out. And lost a few players this year to Japan. Bowden Barrett, TJ Paranara, two, comes to mind, that went off to Japan. But what the best way Super Rugby Aotearoa is, last year, you go into the competition not knowing half the players in the team, and you come out and there's 20 future All Blacks that you can name, because they're all that incredibly talented. There's a new guy for Highlanders called Jonah Nareki, who scored a hat-trick at the weekend, and he is future All Black written all over him. He's 20 years old, and he's just an animal. And they just keep producing these players, and it's really actually easy to watch as a competition, because there's only 2 games every weekend, because there is only 5 teams. So it's not a case like the Pro 14 where there's so many games. Trying to watch them all is impossible. The only problem obviously is the time difference, but with Rugby Pass you can rewatch throughout the day at any time. and it is well worth it. It's rugby at its finest. You know what I mean? It's risk taking. It's aggressive. It's fast paced, and it's just beautiful to see. It really is.
Yeah, I know one of those players that I've been really impressed with in the first kind of opening 2 games, especially for the Crusaders, is Cody Taylor. I think he's been ridiculous. Some of his performances, you look at him, you're like, how's he playing in the front row?
Yeah.
He's one of the more athletic players that you'll see in some of these games, and it just shows you the reason why New Zealand are that good and why it's so hard to beat them. And the fact that during a period of time for Ireland under Smith that we're able to beat New Zealand just shows how good we were playing at that point in time, how good England were last season, or about 18 months ago now with the World Cup. But yeah, it's definitely one to watch. If people don't have Rugby Pass or they can't do that, always go on to YouTube and just watch the highlights on Sky Sports YouTube. It's really, really interesting. You'll see just how fast paced the game is. That's all we have time for today. But I am really glad that you're able to join me today, Stephen, because it's been really good being able to talk about some of this stuff, especially with the Champions Cup, getting some other opinions on that as well. So really appreciate you joining me today.
No worries, man. Thank you for having me. And we'll do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely.